And it's a particular pleasure to give the floor to Daria Onitiu, who is a research assistant in my own team, the Trusted Autonomous System, the regulation node of the Trusted Autonomous System, UKRI mega investment extravaganza. But before she joined us, she did her PhD, which she defended just last month on algorithmic and AI-based fashion recommender systems, a topic particularly close to the heart of my wife, who after 30 years with me totally gave up on any hope to teach me fashion sense and prevent color clashes. And I think Daria's work is for her the last hope to prevent social embarrassment. So important contributions, impactful, already there, but now her work is primarily also on medical information systems, and that's what she's going to talk about today.
Okay, right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today at the First Scotland conference at the wonderful Stirling, and also hello, my online friends. Today I'm going to talk about the role of privacy and data protection safeguards, focusing on the context of the socio-political considerations during the pandemic, which permeated the adoption of digital technology. And I believe that we all agree that one particular striking characteristics of the COVID-19 pandemic has been the deployment of contact tracing apps. The aim of my presentation is to show how trust in the usefulness of these technologies has not been assured from the outset. There were, of course, technical specifications, including the architecture of these apps, which was of important concern, but also there were intervening variables, emotional factors, and information processing failures undermining trust during the mid-2020s until the end of that year and 2021. So indeed, contact tracing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic do not operate in a legal vacuum, but need to correspond to data protection requirements, such as purpose limitation, storage limitation, and transparency, setting the tone for the successful deployment of these tools during crisis. In addition, it is also clear that public health considerations do not operate as a trade-off with privacy during an emergency. But another aspect of the use of contact tracing applications in a crisis is the epidemiological aspect. What is clear is that between the detection of a case and notification of contacts, that must be as quick as possible. However, does that technology actually help to curb the spread? What is clear is that much of the success depends on high user adoption of the technology. It can be significantly lower and then still effective, but only in conjunction with other measures, such as wearing masks, washing your hands, respecting social distancing guidelines. So arguably the role of legal safeguards in this context is not only about enforcing compliance, but also to induce uptake in the technology based on its usefulness to support the fight against the pandemic. Now, the danger of this approach is that legal safeguards are becoming a proxy for the socio-political climate, striving for innovation and rapid response. And as expected, this did not support user adoption of the contact tracing technology in some instances. Let me elaborate on this, focusing on some motivational factors that affected user adoption of the German contact tracing application, the so-called Corona Warn-App. So just as a few couple of examples, a study by researchers from the Department of Psychology at the Humboldt University in Berlin outlines that most frequently named reasons for non-users to download the Corona Warn-App were privacy concerns, doubt about the effectiveness of the app, and lack of technical equipment. However, another study showed that user adoption of this app dropped significantly by the end of 2020, notwithstanding privacy safeguards. So the study, intended to analyze social media comments, does not provide a comprehensive view about all sentiment affecting user adoption, but it gives us an important element, which is that despite the developers' efforts to make the Corona Warn-App data protection friendly, a significant number of people still believe that it violates data privacy. And finally, newspaper articles reporting on the effectiveness of this app in October 2020 revealed that only 60% of the users who were found positive would inform the healthcare authority. So the question arises, what did former German Chancellor Angela Merkel mean when she said that the Corona Warn-App deserves our trust? So what this discussion shows is that indeed we do not trust technology as such, but trust is an interwoven process of risk communication. On a higher level, we see that indeed technical feasibility and overall user experience was a determining factor before the official launch of the Corona Warn-App. But there must be another reason, and that is based on the fact that there has been almost 3 million downloads of a private contact tracing app called the Luca app in April 2021, which is an application that can capture sensitive information about people's movement and at bars and restaurants. So on a concrete level, the question of trust is closely aligned to confidence in leadership, including government and health authorities, and understanding the role of contact tracing to track infections will also positively contribute to curb the spread, and reinforcing your own responsibilities, respecting social distancing, etc. So as argued by the European Data Protection Board, the proportionate use of contact tracing is part of a comprehensive public health strategy. But how that is communicated to the public is quite relevant. So why is the role of risk communication so important during a pandemic? Well, the reason for that is that user perception of a threat can be influenced by emotions. Take the statement on the slide, which gives a good outlook on some of the sentiments highlighted in the newspaper. It says, I don't care if it's actually the petty federalism, the obstinate conference of prime ministers, the bizarre bureaucracy, the broken infrastructure, the constant fear of the screaming of right-wingers and extremists, the complete misjudgment of the course of the pandemic, the party political discourse at the very wrong time, or the decades-long German digitization debacle is behind this pandemic. It's probably a mix of everything. And without going into too much detail about every point raised in the statement, what I want to highlight is the phrase, a mix of everything. Technology cannot be viewed in a vacuum, but its assurances have to be viewed holistically, considering a government's ability of risk management and communication. And in this respect, many researchers analyzed individuals' perception of leadership during the pandemic using cognitive appraisal theory, such as using anger and fear as driving factors to perceive trustworthiness or a decline of trust in the government. So for instance, it is argued that fear leads to a rally round the flag effect, increasing trust, whereas anger can attribute blame for the adverse circumstances to the government and decrease trust. So what is the significance of this with regard to the proportionate use of contact tracing during the pandemic? I would say that measures can be perceived as proportionate or disproportionate by the public, notwithstanding privacy assurances and safeguards, and depending on which factors, emotional factors, precede the reaction of an uncertain threat, including the legitimate aim. So the dimension of public health considerations, which may even give rise to cross-border action to curb the spread, is not equally distributed by virtue of factual considerations, but need to consider intervening variables and perception of risk as well. However, these parameters have not been examined, and they were rather part of the secularization of public health in the EU and debate. And in addition, the eHealth Network's draft interoperability guidelines, whilst promoting common standards of data processing, do allow national health agencies to securely exchange data with each other, but doesn't go into much detail how the use of these tools should occur in a proportionate way. And the problem with this approach is that the pandemic, whilst the public health threat, is not a linear process, and we should be more concerned with the determination of the severity and imminence of an uncertain threat regarding member states' measures on infection control. So take the role of necessity, which is a combined and fact-based assessment supported by evidence describing the problem to be addressed, how it will be addressed, why existing and less intrusive measures cannot sufficiently address it. So the first problem is that with the role of intervening variables, the problem at present becomes an abstract one. So how many infections and possibly deaths do we need to tolerate to intervene with individual rights is a very value-laden and controversial one, notwithstanding the epidemiological aspect of the disease. And this leads me to my second problem and the crux of this. We can have a lot of statistical and scientific evidence about the epidemiological importance of contact tracing, but that does not mean that there's reflectivity and general acceptance of the problem. So there's a problem in how we can identify a general interest, a pressing social need, or the need to balance with other rights of others. So these considerations affect proportionality in the broad sense, in that the Corona Warn app undertook many changes by virtue of technical specifications and problems. Whilst the use of contact tracing might seem appropriate, the role of risk communication complicates the role of effectiveness and whether less intrusive means are available. So what did we just discuss? We just provided a snapshot in how user adoption affected the uptake of the Corona Warn app based on a holistic view of the social political climate surrounding its deployment. I provided an outlook that risk communication can be vital and how proportionate responses are perceived by the public, noting that privacy assurances are not enough to secure public health considerations during crisis. So the second part of my presentation is going to dig a bit deeper into the value of risk communication, focusing on information processing failures and leadership, and moving beyond the effects of risk communication and risk perception. How much time do you have?
You're still well in time. You have 12 minutes and you have 8 minutes before the first warning.
That's right. Yeah. So we are all aware of the controversies regarding the English NHS COVID-19 app. There has been a lot of research on how there was a lot of media controversy at the time. The UK planned to trial that centralized contact tracing app on the Isle of Wight when Dominic Cummings was breaking lockdown rules to travel to Durham in March 2020. And then we saw how the government had a major U-turn whereby the proposal for a centralized contact tracing app had been abandoned in favor of a decentralized model. And that was based on various considerations I'm not discussing today, backlash from privacy experts, technical flaws, and the realities of being dependent on big tech firms. In addition, another aspect of the role of digital technology in this political climate was that much of the discourse was guided by a rhetoric of exceptionalism. And Webster goes even further and argues that policy failure was fueled by a government post-Brexit desire to develop UK solutions to problems and a populist approach to decision-making, which emphasized policy announcements over evidence-based activity. Others, like the House of Commons Health and Social Care and Science and Technology, emphasized that political failure resulted from a phenomena called groupthink, something that is almost inherent in a psychology of group members in situations of stress and risks and undermine effective accountability in group decisions. So what we need to define is the role of inherent bias and how data protection can be used to reinforce rather to escape accountability during a crisis. Let us look at some examples. So we certainly agree on the value of purpose limitation and data minimization principle. So for instance, purposes must be specific enough to exclude further processing for purposes unrelated to the management of the COVID-19 health crisis, such as commercial or law enforcement purposes, and that contact tracing apps do not require tracking the location of individual users. Instead, proximity data should be used. So accordingly, the European Data Protection Board stipulates that careful consideration should be given to the principle of data minimization and data protection by design and default. But when we look at how these principles have been implemented in practice, we see that this was not that easy. Going back to 2020, there was first an emphasis on a centralized architecture. The exact purposes for which data would be used had not been explained, beyond a vague reference to tracing and research and raising questions as to the compliance with purpose limitation. The NHSX only gave 2 official statements, one on the 28th of March and 28th of April. And then later information was added when Matthew Gold, the head of the NHSX, testified before the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee. So what this shows is that the real problem with this approach, that the usefulness has not been put into actionable results from the outset. So for instance, what is the value for citizens was the exchange? How does it fit within the broader framework of the track and trace program? What are the implications to mass opportunistic choices about technology from public scrutiny and oversight? So therefore, the second point would be that mere compliance will need to consider the wider implications of contact tracing digital technology based on a range of information processing failures, such as the risk to maintain a status quo during a crisis, preferring short-term solutions over long-term sustainable benefits. And what this also shows is that expectations is a different value from articulating a purpose of data processing activities. And this is an information processing step, which is about defining complex lines of responsibility and identifying complex lines of causality during a crisis. And it's also about addressing weaknesses, such as recognizing power structures, and also working with roadmaps and being transparent about the risk and potential issues that come up, and that would help to build trust with the citizens. So where does this discussion leave us, and what do I mean with different levels of trust during a crisis, as I suggested in the title? So if emotional responses of fear and anger can shape the trust of the government and uptake of technology, then we can say that it shapes the sense of information, including the epidemiological aspect of public health measures, such as what is a valid statement of a public health threat and what is not. And it can seriously undermine the legitimate uses of digital technology during a crisis. And further, if stress situations create a plethora of biases, then we also need to be worried that information becomes a statement of truth, of a political agenda, a source of power, or simply acting on the unknown without the consideration of alternative viewpoints. The current role of data protection and privacy during COVID-19 is about drawing evidence-based conclusions on shaky grounds. So ideas how can we extend those safeguards to include the reality of a different sense of information and different senses of truth. One aspect is to define the use of technology to create positive expectations about the assurances within a crisis. So the idea is, how can a nuanced assessment of intervening variables inform evidence-based solutions based on their trust factors, such as engagement of civil society, transparency, and inclusivity. Second, trust is about articulating long-term interest. This, of course, requires oversight and democratic scrutiny to define the foreseeability and avoidability of specific outcomes, and from that can promote data protection principles. Thank you very much for your attention.